Hello, my name is Autumn Brown, and I'm a researcher with Oklahoma State's Oklahoma Oral History Research Program. For our Art, Activism, and Education Oral History Project, today, March 16th, 2022, I am meeting with Francheska Alcantara to discuss their work as an artist in the Tulsa community. So, Francheska, thank you so much for talking with me today. Let's just start by, where are you from? What were you like growing up? What was your community like where you grew up in?
I grew up in a Caribbean island shared by the Dominican Republic and Haiti, I was born and raised there, and I grew up basically with my grandparents and sort of like my dad's side of the family, and they had brought kind of like their country living into our city. We lived in the capital, but I grew up with like a lot of animals, a lot of like a garden and a patio, and I was also kind of like the only child, so I played a lot, kind of like outside in that setting, then I moved to the United States to live with my mom's family in New York. I come from a community where people kind of like help each other out, where there is where family it's really connected, and I mean, there's sort of like, I would say maybe some conservative values that maybe prompted me to kind of like move to the States and wanted to do something else and kind of like wanted to become independent. But still you're sort of like very, as a family, you're kind of like a tight unit, and you look out for each other.
So how old were you when you moved to the States?
I was 17 years old.
Okay.
Yeah.
So was it like a shock for you moving to New York, or what was that transition like?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have come here to visit, and visit kind of like on vacation, but never to live. So, it was definitely kind of a shocking experience culturally. Kind of like the rhythm of like life was very different. The setting, I came from sort of like living, like I said, in a house where there was a patio or garden. It was, and then I sort of like, I was living in urban New York City, in the Bronx, so just architecture was sort of like something very different, in the way that people were moving, in the way that it's sort of, kind of like family members, kind of like came, and took care of each other, and it kind of like small quarters because of this dense population. And it was sort of like definitely a big adjustment.
Yeah. So tell me about your early introduction to art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, that I think really started when I was kind of like young, I think I was a person that was very interested in culture and in sort of like the different ways in which culture is manifested through artistic forms. And that to me was sort of like, it has always been kind of like a parallel of learning about the history of a place. And you do that by sort of like seeing, either dance forms or actual kind of like visual arts, sort of like, I think through food as well, so I think my artistic sort of like the pursuit of artistic sort of, kind of like a career, it really started as a curiosity about, how cultural norms are sort of like formed, and what makes a society, and how that is a kind of like an important reflection of what people value, and sort of like how history, how legacies are maintained.
So what are some like in your early life, so what are some of your early experiences with creating art as a child or just before you got to this like level of artistry? What are some early experiences with creating art?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think I was it's interesting because of course you're sort of like your background, you know, and the circumstances in which you grow, it's are kind of like very much influential. I think my father was like the person that was the most artistic person in my family. Nobody else is an artist, to be honest. So, you know, my dad was sort of like learning how to play instruments and had that kind of like around. I sort of like was trying to learn how to play the guitar. I was taking some drawing classes. Very, you know, even in school there was sort of like we had like, you know, theater or something like that. But basically, you know, resources honestly were very few in order to kind of like try to pursue, you know, kind of like art in general. So for me, it was something. It was interesting because I was never the child that was like drawing or, you know, but I was to me it was sort of like interesting to witness it, right? And I think that I came to art more through reading, you know, and kind of like literature, and then connecting that, making that sort of like a historical, I guess, understanding history through in the way that an artist would sort of like, you know, kind of like see it, or yeah, the perspective of an artist in sort of like making sense of the times being. So that to me, yeah, I guess I came to art late in the sense of actually making. I came to art through history. That's kind of like what I studied. And I guess part of that is, you know, again, a background of like, you know, working class background where people are telling you, well, you need to kind of like be, you know, be in this particular field or whatever. You're like, oh, wow, you know, what's going to be the secure job that I'm going to have in the future, whatever.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And that is kind of thrown at folks in like working class backgrounds where they don't see the profitability of art often, or art is rendered as like a hobby rather than a career.
Right.
So, I mean, you've clearly, you know, rebuked all of those, but when did you find yourself really challenging those ideas and realizing like art is more than just a hobby, and it's not just profitable, but it's something where you can connect your passion, but also see that it does reap a profit.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting because I think there's a sensibility, right? A sensibility to the artists have. And I think I always find myself in that place of, you know, kind of like a place of imagination, a place of dreaming, a place of play. And that was kind of like, you know, you're able to kind of like have parallel worlds kind of like in that. One of the things that happened to me once I arrived here in the States, and after really kind of like having a very kind of like hard time trying to adapt to being here in some way, I actually joined the military, and I joined the U.S. Navy. So I was able to travel to different countries, and I think for me that was also kind of like key in order to understand maybe how art and culture were sort of like functioning in a particular place. So that to me was sort of like my affirmation, like, oh wow, this is kind of like something that is, I don't know, it's interesting. It's it's kind of like an opening of perspective. It's sort of like seeing different worlds, seeing different people, and how in what sort of like structures or systems, or in what ways they are sort of like able to have a very particular way of doing things, you kind of like realize that. And I don't know, it might be style, it might be taste. So that to me sort of like got me into then as a, sort of like as an affirmation of, well, I'm going to study art history, and that's kind of like what I did, right? And I think that the idea from that would be to you know, I guess understand art through the lens of research in a way, and um, that to me was sort of like a foundational even in the growth of becoming an artist, because I think sometimes there are artists that I have encountered who are artists that maybe are actually making things with their hands they have been doing that for a long time, but they don't have sort of like the art historical perspective or sort of like the broader perspective of the world and how they fit and how art actually fits, kind of like in this sort of like, kind of like world of imagination, and how are you able to kind of like pull references and find kind of like a lineage of a particular investigation, a particular conversation, a particular thing that an artist is curious about. And I think those were sort of like formative experiences for me to become the artist that I am today. Mm-hmm.
So as you were kind of becoming this burgeoning artist, and you mentioned what's curious to an artist, what were you curious about as you kind of blossomed into your art career?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot goes back to trying to make sense of who I am, and coming, having the background of actually living in the, being born and raised in the Caribbean, and just sort of like being, part of, I guess, different, kind of like definitely different cultures that kind of like collided, right? And there's, sort of like this kind of like omnipresence of a kind of like indigenous culture within the Americas, right? That it's very much, it lives through language, it lives through sort of like, food and kind of like people that want to sort of like continue and want to sort of like fully understand that art, sort of like that sort of like manifestation of kind of how indigenous culture, it has a presence, right? And then I think, of course, we sort of like need to understand the political and the sort of like socio-political context of colonization, right? And what that sort of like brought to the Americas, and also that, sort of like the slave trade through the Atlantic, right? So then, fully understanding, okay, there is sort of like the genocide of people, understood sort of like the enslavement of people and how unjust, through sort of like white supremacists, sort of like Eurocentric ideas, how that sort of, it's sort of, I don't know, it's kind of like, it's on display, and that to me then, it serves as a trying to understand how do I fit in that history, how do I push back against those, kind of like colonialist, kind of like imperialist, kind of like powers, and how do you find kind of like self-definition in your own terms and how you connect, and make sure that that I guess the art and the history and the human connection that existed before, kind of like that trauma, how you are still kind of still affirming it and making it manifest in your art.
I love what you said about self-definition. Mm-hmm. And we talked a little bit before this about like my use of Black feminist framing, and Black feminism really pushes self-valuation and self-definition, like defining yourself as part of this group deemed the other, but defining yourself against that. And so I love that you mentioned that your art kind of does that. So can you talk to how your art defines you, or how you, like how the pieces behind you are your artwork. So like
Right.
how your pieces of art are a little bit of like how you self-define yourself. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, it's. I think it's interesting because this idea of self-definition also, in some way, it is sort of like self-definition outside of a box, or outside of a monolithic identity. So I think that's sort of like what, to me, it's kind of like a really broadening of that I can be multiple selves, and I think in the way that I sort of like do that in my work is actually taking as a maybe kind of like a signifier within kind of like Caribbean culture by utilizing soap. And this is it's guava soap. It's sort of like a soap that is sort of like used for like the everyday, like washing of clothing or cleaning, and people also sort of like wash their bodies with it. And to me, it's interesting to actually just kind of like take the soap and deconstruct it in different layers, and that's why I just sort of like see this as an actual sort of like breakdown of the actual soap, where I was breaking it down, grating it, pulverizing it to actually make this piece, right? But this is a type of soap that I grew up using in my household, that is a quintessential item in domestic, in households in the Dominican Republic and in the diaspora. The interesting thing about this soap is that the brand of the soap is Hispano. So if you actually make a connection of like what is, I guess the ethnicity of being Hispano is a direct connection to kind of like a European connection, and at the same time it's a colonizing. It has kind of like a connotation of colonization as well. So to me, by actually breaking down this particular soap that is, the brand is Hispano, is actually also sort of like breaking down that sort of like the change of colonization, sort of like is an act of decolonizing my mind, and breaking down the structures. So there is but within that, it's sort of like it's a process that is in a way very much as well. It's a complicated process in a sense, right? Because there is, if you see this piece, there's burning, there's sort of like holes poked through this thing. There's, there's sort of like a deterioration of this particular material, taking of it, also kind of like breaking it down, and then sort of like arriving in some way from that deconstruction, and arriving kind of like, rising from those ashes in a way, to kind of like arrive at this and actually have like, there's some flower petals embedded into golden leaves also here. So there is sort of like a beauty within that process of, kind of breaking down, tearing down, maybe the outside skin of it in order to get to something more profound, right? And maybe something more beautiful.
Yeah. So that piece on your left is, there's the materials used are soap, leaves, and golden flowers.
Yeah, and then these are sort of what I call like vinyl. And these are things that are used for in kitchens, when they actually lay down, how you call it, like surfaces that they sort of like line them up, like if you have your kitchen island or something like that, and they lay down with this. The name always escapes me.
Like like what you put on the floor, like the laminate stuff.
Laminate? Yeah, it's like laminate.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I mean that is used also on like kitchen surfaces as well. So there's sort of like something to me, it's also an interesting thing of actually taking non-traditional art materials and making art with them. I think that is also sort of like part of my own artistic process of in practice of sort of like pushing against the traditional norms of how art is supposed to be made, right? And with that, there's kind of like a personal history. You know, these items or this sort of these kind of materials have another life already, you know, embedded onto them. So I sort of like work with those materials, transform them in order to, you know, sort of like make something new out of it, right? So there is a remixing, right? There's kind of like a recycle. There's an upcycling. There is a passage of time as well, which is, you know, kind of like embedded, you know, and embedded onto this piece, and it becomes kind of like a capsule, right? A capsule of different informations, of different origins, and that, you know, kind of like arrives at, you know, being this. The piece is called Petals of Dust.
Could you repeat that?
Petals of Dust.
Okay.
And it's also sort of like a, you know, it's kind of a rumination, you know, it's kind of like a poetic, even a kind of like a poetic process of trying to name things, but also sort of like trying to get into maybe more of the feeling, you know, of kind of like what they are.
So you just had an exhibit, Skin the Floor. Did I say that right?
Skin Le Fleur.
Skin the Floor. Okay. At the Liggett Studio.
Yeah.
And could you talk to me like from the genesis all the way into the exhibition? Like how did the idea sprout into your mind about how you wanted to craft these pieces all the way to how you exhibited them at the studio?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think, you know, that the process of my studio is that I collect objects from like my house, from, you know, kind of like small corner stores from the street, and I bring them here to the studio, and then I just start to manipulate, you know, those materials. It's interesting because there is sort of like a physical manipulation of the materials, and there's also sort of like a passage of time that happens, right? There's some things that I can start working on then, and then I sort of like, there's something else that comes up, and, you know, so that piece is kind of like, okay, I'm gonna leave you at this particular stage, and then I can come back to you or something like that, right? Or if there's something like, oh wow, this is kind of like what the piece needed or something, right? There's a process of accumulation. There's an accumulation of ideas, and there's also sort of like a material accumulation onto these pieces. That's why you kind of like see on this particular work something maybe kind of like a different approach to it, actually using soil that I collected from Tulsa, right? Wow. So there's a combination of the soap that I was just referencing to, that I grew up using, that, you know, my family uses, that people in the diaspora, right, uses, and then there is a grounding of place and time as I'm actually using the soil that I found here in this particular place, right? So with that sort of like influence and rumination about how do I find myself here, right? That's kind of like one of the things about artists, right? Is that we have to constantly reinvent ourselves. And we have to be constantly sort of like asking questions of why is it that what we're doing, and where are we sort of like placing ourselves? What is the kind of like, you know, the involvement, the personal, the political involvement into making art, right? And even sort of like the emotion, you know, kind of like the emotional involvement into trying to make something out of nothing,
yeah.
You know, and feeling affirmed to that. So it's beautiful that after all this kind of like different accumulations of materials, of time, of perspectives, then you're unable to sort of like put a body of work together, right? And this piece was started maybe, kind of like 3 years ago, right? And it has gone through different sort of like processes to arrive at what it is. And then, but that piece definitely informed the process of how this particular work was done, and sort of like, that's why I'm saying they sort of like become capsules, right? So they become kind of like capsules of energy, and spaces. And I guess once that's done, you sort of like maybe do a series of them. You're like, oh wow, there's language, there's something there that I can kind of like, I don't show, or there's something that it will be interesting to have kind of like a visual dialogue with, with other things. And so the opportunity came to be able to sort of like show at a local gallery here at Liggett. And I had a conversation with the director, and they're like, Steve Liggett said, apply for, kind of like I have open calls to create a schedule for exhibitions. So I did, and I guess that since last summer, that's when I sort of like started to think about, okay, what is the show going to be like? I'm already creating a specific sort of like explorations with these particular works, or the brown paper bag works that I have as well. There's a combination also of languages in terms of like painting and sculpture, right? There's like a hybrid, these are various cultural pieces, but they are sort of like onto onto a wall, right? And then from that, I started to think, okay, I don't know, there's just, inspiration can come from so many places, right? And references can come from so many places. I follow a lot. I'm trying to figure it out. Sometimes some phrases that cannot be translated. I am a kind of like Spanish speaker, right? And there are some words or phrases idioms that cannot be actually translated, and there's this phrase that it says "a flor de piel," and "a flor de piel" is the closest thing in English that I can think of what that means. Is that when you wear your heart on your sleeve. And what that is sort of like, having kind of like an accumulation of very honest emotion that it is, is not it's on the surface, but it comes from from a deep space of actually feeling, and a deep space of empathy as well. And you cannot hold on to that energy, you have to release it, right? So that is that's sort of like a flor de piel is when those things are sort of like bubbling up so much, that if you were to translate a flor de piel word, it would be kind of like a flower of skin, or or a skin made of flowers. And that's why then the truncation of language is so interesting poetically to me as a process, right? And that's why then the show, within that truncation, then I find the show then being called Skill the Flirt, kind of like an English word using also some kind of like French word of the flower, right? Within, instead of like, it becomes kind of like a truncation of, kind of like of all of that. There's kind of like some popular culture references. I follow, a maker like Tyler, the Creator, right? And Tyler has, kind of like a brand that is called Golf Le Flirt, right? And that to me, I'm interested in the proposition of being multifaceted as a maker, as a creative, and being able to kind of like dabble in many, kind of like in many different things. And I think that's somebody that has done that, in their own way. So I sort of like, I respect that very much, and I, as a creative myself, I also sort of like find that an inspiration within kind of like the medium that I have as a visual artist, right? And for that, then there's just kind of like, you know, a number, I guess, of pieces that kind of like just came together before the show, during the show, you know, and that just kind of like made the proposition of Skin Le Fleur happen.
Okay, so we have to transcribe these. So when you say fleur de pearl.
Look, can I put some chapstick on? So?
Yes.
Because I just feel like that sort of like my things like my lips are my dry. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. So fleur de pearl. What does the phrase you use for where?
Oh, the phrase in Spanish.
Yes.
Is a flor
de
piel.
Okay.
And I can maybe write that for you.
That would be great.
Yeah, I'll write it.
I'm thinking about when we transcribe it and we're all going to be like,
what the heck?
How do you spell
I'll write that. Yeah, totally.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Of course, I'll write that.
And I wanted to ask, because there's so much significance in each of these pieces with your use of material.
Yeah.
Is there a significance in the shape of the pieces?
Yeah, I think that it definitely those are pieces that just really came about in my drawings, right? So there's kind of like just kind of like doodling. I realized that I was just very interested in this kind of like bulky, you know, heavy shape in a way. And then I also kind of like started to equate them to teeth and to thinking about, you know, kind of like the teeth, like my grandmother. I'm definitely thinking a lot about my grandmother who actually had some golden teeth. And that to me as a child, it was sort of like very interesting that my grandmother was like such a, you know, G before, you know, we gotta like realize what is that, you know, it was sort of like so cool and so black at the same time, you know, so that to me sort of like, it's kind of like a little bit of homage kind of like to that. That's why also sort of like that allowed then for kind of like other works, right, to kind of, and I don't know if I can show some of these other works too, right? So that kind of like makes kind of like a work like this, which is maybe kind of like another, you know, there's the soap, right? There's like the Hispano-Cuba soap. There's also kind of like this process of burning and taking away wood, which is kind of like very similar to something like this. But it's also kind of like a, maybe kind of like a smaller version, right, of another, a different type of tooth, right? And at the same time, you know, it's interesting because these are pieces that are not, you know, evoking that immediately. You know, so I'm also interested in that kind of like in between when something is not completely deciphered, right? When something is not, and that to me is such a like a human process. You know, why we would kind of like just have one meaning where there could be, you know, kind of like different things coming together, right? So I think that's sort of like part, you know, kind of like part of that. You know, this is interesting to me. So this was not in the show, but this is also.
That didn't look familiar.
Yeah, this was not on the show, but this is also kind of like part of that process of kind of like accumulation, different materials. There were a lot of flowers, dry flowers that I used also on Skin Le Fleur, and it was because those were flowers that I saved for that, you know, that time that I have been here. So that also sort of like those are sort of like Tulsa things that I'm connecting directly to Tulsa and the soil of Tulsa, living in Tulsa, and also trying to capture a particular energy,
And then what other, you have the soap on there.
Yeah, there's soap, there's sort of like dry flowers, there's sort of like also some materials that I collected here from the train tracks as well. And some of the other pieces I have also sort of have, kind of like this, this sort of connection to place. I've been trying to kind of like figure out what that, kind of like what that is, or how do I, how do I find myself here, having, knowing also kind of like the history of Tulsa, right? And the history of Tulsa around, around sort of like the, sort of like the forced removal, sort of like Trail of Tears, sort of like indigenous, sort of killings and still genocide and invisibility of kind of like indigenous nations here, coming here in 2020, exactly when then Tulsa becomes kind of like, finally and formally kind of like Indian territory, and indigenous folks still having to fight for that, kind of like for that right to their land, to, to sort of like seeing and, kind of like coming also on the, around the, the commemoration of the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre, right? And that also sort of like being something very much in the air and in the energy, and being a witness, to sort of like how, a community of, kind of like Black folk here having to sort of like, the reckoning of that history, and still the sort of like the injustice of not having reparations, the, sort of like the whitewashing of that history too, right? And still sort of like thriving, and still sort of like making it happen, which is something that I connect very much to, from in the way that I sort of like grew up, and also sort of like how, Dominicans and how a lot of the the invisibility, the erasure of also indigenous people in this in the global South, and also the erasure, genocide, and sort of like dismissal of kind of like African, our African influence and heritage, so that to me is sort of like an arriving, an arriving in Tulsa, kind of like with all of that, knowing that there was also in the Dominican Republic, in between Haiti, there was also a massacre that happened in 1937, very much, very similar to, sort of like racial reckoning and trying to, the Dominican government actually is sponsoring killings of Haitians and, Dominicans of Haitian descent right at the border, right?
I didn't know about that.
Yeah, so that to me, arriving in Tulsa for me is it sort of like becomes kind of like, oh shit, it's kind of like a full circle moment of, and that's something that is part of my research here in some way. It's how are these histories in parallel, right? And yeah, under what circumstances it happened, and what were the artists, how artists sort of like responded to that, and are responding to that, and how I didn't learn that, for instance, the same thing here, right? That the massacre in DR, which is maybe I'll write that for you, like Massacre de Perejil, right? So the Massacre of Perejil is something that I didn't learn from history books. It was sort of like through, kind of like artists and cultural workers that, they are sort of like bringing that history back. and around. And the same thing here in Tulsa, right? That was not something that was taught.
So one thing you mentioned was the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre last year. And I'm so glad you mentioned like the air and the energy was so thick because I moved around April-ish, so about a month before everything happened. And that time between like my move and after the centennial, like past Juneteenth, was really heavy. And I couldn't explain the heaviness. And it was just something that I couldn't like pinpoint, like this happened specifically. But hearing you say that and just talking to other people, it's like, it was really just something about the time and that 100-year centennial moment where it was like, it was just in the air. So can you kind of just talk about like you as an artist during that time, that space, and how you kind of like reckoned with that energy? Because it wasn't a good feeling kind of thing. And it was being celebrated around the town, like with these celebrities and all these events, but it wasn't like a cause for celebration. And for a lot of people, it was like heavy in the sense of like, I don't want to celebrate and see John Legend. So can you kind of talk about, as an artist, how you kind of reckoned with that energy and maybe how you even channeled that into some of your work?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think one, honestly, it depends on the type on the person and the type of artist that you are, because I think there are some people that maybe in all, amongst that particular energy, I think you have to be available to it, and I guess you have to care, right? So as I sort of like was feeling that energy, where I also couldn't say specifically what it was just something that was felt, and I was trying to make sense of it. I took a lot of walks around. I sort of like, in taking walks, I was just sort of like trying to ground myself, and also trying to ground my thoughts, and my feelings about it. Definitely becoming in contact with, kind of like older people that actually live here was also important in order to learn about what, kind of like what was it that they were doing, and I think, in between that, also going through a process of, oh wow, I just moved basically across the country, right, to a brand new place. I don't know anybody here, dealing with that kind of like, the emotional, that emotional process, dealing with depression, like heavy with depression as well, right? So with that, it just took me time. It took definitely time, a lot of time of me actually bringing flowers into my house in order to, have kind of like more vitalizing energy, sort of like making myself feel kind of like comfortable and soothed and soothing my own self, right? And also sort of like understanding that I needed to listen a lot to what people were sort of like saying, about themselves here, and what, so to me, I sort of like took a position of a witness, and witnessing also, kind of like witnessing through not only through my eyes, but sort of like also witnessing kind of like the feeling and how that was affecting my body. So I walked a lot, and I crossed the train tracks a lot into, kind of like from one area to the other, right? Which was what kind of like divided the city, right? So that to me becomes such a liminal space, right? A liminal space of, becomes kind of like a portal of of time, where I can move through and understand kind of like the kind of like psychogeography of kind of like place, right? And I collected in my walks. I also collect a lot of items, and to me it was very important. It was very hard also to kind of like go onto the train tracks and collect items. And maybe one of the pieces that I sort of maybe have to open this one up. But yeah, so one of the pieces that I did from that. Oh wow. Was actually this particular work, right? So this work definitely came from collecting items around the train tracks.
Wow.
And there is, there are sort of like this twigs, some of them are sort of like from flowers, some of them are from trees that, were sort of like either, kind of like plants or things that were around. There's kind of like this kind of like plastic, I cannot tell, broken plastic that was there. There's this like sleeve, from a shirt and, kind of like this, I don't know, this flag kind of thing, plastic with this metal around it. So I think that this was to me kind of like a very important piece to to maybe kind of like commemorate in my own way that the walks that I did, and even kind of like the grounding to find place and to also think about kind of like the histories and the stories of things that were left behind, and maybe bringing that into my art as a kind of as a testament of presence. There's like so much. That's why I'd like to work with items that I find on the street that have other lives, because there's already an accumulated energy, and there is sort of like a process of maybe kind of like transformation and reinterpretation of what kind of like those things are.
Yeah.
So I think it was sort of like important to get also my body involved into this, as a process of keeping myself busy, not to kind of like, it's interesting not to kind of like, rather than, thinking and maybe kind of like having so many things percolating in your head, actually kind of like being active, actively, channeling energy into making our work.
Yeah.
But that takes time.
Yeah.
that doesn't come. I think there's some people, I don't know, there's some people that are sort of like able to be like, oh, I can do this, boom, 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 and like get it done. I don't know, for me it's kind of like such an emotional process to go through and to make things happen, and then there's kind of like this embodiment of that energy, and that sort of like gets manifested onto the artworks.
One piece of art that was really interesting to me in your exhibit were the paper bags.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk through like the significance of the paper bags that you used throughout your latest exhibit at Liggett Studios?
Yeah, totally. So paper bags is something also that I just sort of like started collecting for a while, and I have a number of them, right? So, for instance, these are some of the paper bags.
Yeah, that one was.
Yeah.
I remember.
So, let's see. Let me put maybe one by one. So paper bags I've been, for a long time, I've been very interested in drawing on brown paper or craft paper, because it just there's a quality of when you actually trace it onto paper that it just feels more physical. And that's sort of, again, that's kind of like part of my own process, right? So, from craft paper, something that is kind of like around a lot is, paper bags. And I was sort of like, I don't know, in the Bronx, you kind of like, you can go to a bodega and you go, you get like a drink or something like that, and it's put into a paper bag, I don't know. Sometimes you can go to a supermarket and, paper bags, or you go to McDonald's and you can see freaking paper bags everywhere, right? So I started collecting the paper bags to maybe to start drawing on them in some way, and they just also kind of like, they're receptacles, right? Receptacles of items that we use, and they can be discarded. I'm very interested on that. I guess is detritus of a society, of a community, right? What are the things that we leave behind? And paper bags are one of those things, right? Because it's interesting because it's sort of like, it's a material, it's definitely kind of like a material affinity to them. And I started working with them, and just, I remember, I sort of like, I think I saw an artist actually using kind of like brown paper bags in their work. And so I started researching them. And then from that I learned about that kind of like the history of the design of the brown paper bags, but also the very, very violent history of the brown paper bag test, right? That is used kind of like, it's such a racist, colorist, I guess, I don't know, action, whatever. So on, understanding myself as a person that didn't grow up in the context of the United States, to understand the brown paper bag test, but understanding that as a Black person facing racism and colorism, all the time, and I was able to kind of like relate to that. So to me, in some way, by utilizing brown paper bags and sort of like taking away some of that violent history, and sort of like, again, kind of like redefining it and reinterpreting that and making that as a sort of like, I don't know, kind of like flipping it, in a way. And, as I also sort of like finding myself doing more research about it, I also see that, the Black Panthers were using brown paper bags for their free food program, right? So that to me is sort of like, then again, from going, from being an item of violence through this, brown paper bag test, to sort of like being, a catalyzer of change for, people like radicals like the Black Panthers that were actually, looking, for a different, for a different way to live in community, right? And dreaming, and understanding the importance of feeding, sort of like feeding individuals, and having, sort of like having the social fabric of, of a community, and understanding sort of like mutual aid, that also sort of like brings it back to me as a person that has taken part in mutual aid efforts, in New York, actually with like food distribution through a collective that I'm part of that is called the North Bronx Collective. And at the height of the pandemic in 2020, we were actually distributing cooked food, like organic food, and also organic produce in the Bronx, right? So it becomes kind of like full cycle to a, kind of like a, maybe an exploration of a material, but then it also filters through kind of like everyday life, right? And who I am, and how do I move as a community member, right? So that is sort of like what these works kind of like are, and they this one in particular, there's sort of like, there's kind of like these flower elements to them, but it has been stiffened with sugar and salt, and also sort of like some lime, and kind of like painted in this kind of reddish, kind of like dark reddish paint. So there's I also see, I think part of the affinity with brown paper bags is to see my own brown body, and so right in the brown body of a lot of people. So that I guess it becomes definitely, rather than using like white paper to draw on, but I'm not using brown paper to draw on, it's just, I don't know, it just feels closer to home, in a way.
That is so layered. And it really kind of sticks to your idea about deconstructing things that have been violent and then making them anew with the pieces behind you that you talked about, and same with the brown paper bags. But it's just interesting to know and have more context about the lenses through which you kind of got to this final product.
Right. Yeah, totally. And I mean, I kind of this and this, and yeah, so these ones are also sort of like similar in that, this one has the crystallized salt and sugar, and understanding to me, and even kind of like fishing line as well. Sort of like as a person that is, coming from an island where, you're sort of, the water is such an important element to kind of like who we are, and how do we sort of like move about, kind of like move around, and understanding that there's like this saltiness also in the air that is corrosive, to sort of metal and things like that, right? Or rusted. Things become rusted and broken down. Even the history also of like sugar production, right? And plantation life too, and sort of, so there is, there's sort of like, this kind of like this combination of all of those things and all those histories, onto this sort of like very much, kind of like fossilized shape, of this brown paper bag, but that, but this transcends, all the kind of like either regular uses, and it becomes definitely kind of like an accumulation of histories, and, kind of like manifestations of how that kind of like plays out, or even kind of like this one too, right? With some kind of like golden paint. There's these were also kind of like submerged in like baths of like natural dyeing as well, with like coffee or flowers.
Wow.
So
That's, again, like, this is what I was talking about with artists. Like, I think sometimes we go into a gallery, we go into a museum, and we see the works of art, but to really unpack and understand like what was going through an artist's head and the purpose and the significance, it's always so much deeper. I mean, I can look at that and be like, okay, they took a brown paper bag and they colored it and added these things, and it's really beautiful, and then leave it at that. But to understand like the historical significance of the brown paper bag test, the significance about your personal culture and going to a bodega, or the work you do with the food distribution and the Black Panther, like they're so historically layered. And I think that that's important for us to really unpack and understand art and the meaning of art and the significance of art in our socio-political climate, So this is truly amazing. Talk to me about like your vision for the project you want to begin next.
Yeah. Well, as a interdisciplinary artist, it's not only one project. It's like
projects.
Plural. Sort of like that. Things are always there. They always come in multiples. And again, I think that comes in multiples because there's just different. Different access points, right, and different things that can be made. The project that I'm working on is actually titled Ears to the Ground, Ears to the Ground, an ethnography of material, sound, and conversations. And the idea is to really pay attention to what's happening between and with the communities of color, specifically the Black community and the Latinx community of color here, and even also I'm thinking of like indigenous folk as well that have those different intersections as well, right? I am interested in sort of learning about the local history here and what are the points of solidarity between those different communities and how they sort of like merge and, you know, kind of like collaborate with each other and live with each other in the context of Tulsa. And, you know, the work is, or sort of like the project is, it has different facets, right? There's sort of like the research process of how, I guess, the different communities, you know, have established themselves here, how they arrive here, how they're living here. There's the, you know, kind of like the process of I would say, to me, sort of like the material history of those communities here as well. And that, and you know, sort of like basically going out to specific neighborhoods. You know, what are the stores? What are the where do people go to buy food? Where do people, you know, kind of like come and gather together? You know, what are sort of like things that are left out on the street as well, right? Also sort of like what are the sounds that are in this particular, you know, kind of like in this particular, you know, communities, you know, is there a highway, you know, I mean, you know, we know kind of like how disruptive the Highway 244 has been to, you know, the Greenwood community here.
Yeah.
So, what are some of the things? What are some of the green spaces that are in these communities? You know, are people kind of like walking on the street? Are they playing? You know, are kids playing on the street? And you know, and then also just having conversations, kind of like with people. You know, how do you? What are some of the things that you do here? How are you able to reach out? You know. To other folk, how do you live? You know, in harmony. How do you arrive at kind of like harmony, kind of like within community, right? Part of the project also is sort of, or is kind of like smaller part of it, or it's also sort of like taking portraits of individuals, and I'm calling that exchanging horizons, where I'm going to do a photograph. The project is going to be two portraits, sort of like hung or displayed as diptychs, one next to each other, with people that have very similar sort of like biographical information, whether that is, you know, kind of age, gender, but they're from these kind of like different communities, and trying to arrive at, okay, within that, you know, the diptych kind of like idea, trying to find points of similarity sort of like between them, and that also sort of like looking at another sort of like portrait or piece from that is that I'm going to be making objects from that those individuals would tell me, okay, this is something that I use kind of like on the everyday, this is something that I grew up using, this is something that I like, this is something that I have in my house, this is something that I cannot get rid of, or something like that. And sort of like bringing also sort of like the poetics of, you know, realizing that although you're sort of like, you have been using this independently in your house for who knows how many years to your family, somebody else's maybe has something similar also in their house too. Okay. Or something that they kind of like have access to, they, you know, they're constantly just having around them. So I think overall, the idea of either exchanging horizons or, for me, kind of like ears to the ground, is to arrive at, that understanding of different intersections and how we are ourselves and how we are sort of like our multiple selves as well.
Yeah.
Right. And there's sort of like an aspect of, kind of like me intervening, and being sort of like the facilitator and maybe conductor, how those connections are made. And some of them they could be very evident and some of them may not be,
Wow, that sounds really amazing. I mean, I love ethnographic work, so
Yeah.
it's like my favorite type of research methodology. So,
Cool.
and I think that, I mean, when you think about like the different identities in Tulsa, you have such a rich indigenous, also Afro-Indigenous community. And I think sometimes like they get boxed into like you're either African American or you're indigenous,
Right.
but they have both of those identities wrapped up in them. But then like you like to think about historically and the research of why they've had to choose between their African American or indigenous communities and
Yeah.
why there's such that disconnect there. So I think that project will be really powerful, especially here in Tulsa where it's like we could be so divided sometimes.
Yeah, and I find that, and I'm sort of like trying to figure it out. Okay, I mean, geographically, definitely there's a lot of division. So, in what ways are we able to kind of like cross those I don't know, either boundaries, geographical boundaries, or segments, how we are able to kind of like blur some of those lines, and also sort of like seeing the Latinx community who has there's a lot of also kind of like indigenous heritage within the community, and there's also kind of like a reckoning of how do we see ourselves also as racialized individual, kind of like racialized beings, and how a lot of us are actually Black, as well. So that to me, I'm excited, kind of like I am excited to take on that project. Also kind of like as an offering, of kind of like my talents, my skills, as an offering of attention, because I think when you are, an artist traveling around, and it's a beautiful process because you sometimes have to, find yourself, you go where the opportunities are, right? And I don't know, at the same time, you're trying to sort of like bring yourself, to these opportunities. But for me, sort of like an important dialogue to have when you are not extracting, because there's a lot of history of abstraction, that's colonialism, that's, imperialism all the time. So in what ways as an artist, I am also sort of like able to offer, attention and able to sort of also kind of like have a presence,
Yeah. So the last question I have is just, as an artist, what do you define the role of an artist as in the larger world around them? Like, what do you think is your job as an artist?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, and I mean, I just have kind of like a poster here of James Baldwin, right? So I think as an artist, James Baldwin was always sort of like thinking about artists being kind of like part of I guess, part of the kind of, we're sort of like test tubes, within the lab. We have to ask the questions that haven't been answered. You sort of like, you listen to the answers and then you're like, oh, okay, that's your answer. But I think there's actually more questions to be asked from those answers, right? So you're kind of like in this constant kind of like research or it's sort of like in this constant, process as a curious person of finding the questions and the answers I'm not answering, right? So I think as an artist, I see myself as a conjurer, right? As a sort of like a catalyzer of ideas, of information that is kind of like diving into information that is now readily available, readily seen, of rescuing history, right? Or rescuing material histories and sort of like having kind of like having the role of a poetic conjurer that is able to sort of like bring about sort of like those histories, those connections, and manifest them visually, right? I think there's also a reflection of on time. There's a reflection on how do I, as an artist, how am I responding to the times that I live in? How I am reflecting on that, and how relevant that makes me for the time in which I'm kind of like on this earth in this particular sort of like presentation, right? So that to me sort of like very important, kind of like as an artist, to have that sensibility, to have that emotional connection, and to be able to within that to also sort of like find the humanistic lens of kind of like reflection, rumination, and taking time, to maybe reflect and maybe arrive at something.
Yeah. That was really great.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you want to add before we close? Is there anything you feel like we missed?
I don't know. I think I talked a lot.
No, I mean, that's
sort of
perfect.
like it's one of those things.
You were gold for
It's one
world
of those
history.
things. Yeah. That's sweet. I think we did a lot. We did a lot, and I'm going to be working more, and hopefully, sort of, I guess, some of the work getting into other, kind of like other things as well, with my studio practice, and yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for spending some of your day with me and just taking the time and spilling your guts about your art. I really appreciate it. Future generations definitely will appreciate it. So
Yes.
we will close with that and just thank you so much.
Cool.